back. This is Real Mike Life, the starting the 10th novel segment. Thank you guys very much for joining us here this Wednesday evening, or if you're tuned in live or the archive. The archive. That's the other thing. The archive. We got an email from a listener who was asking about mirrorless cameras. They've got an old Nikon D50, my first camera, DSLR camera, and they're interested in a new camera. They've got an iPhone, but they want more control over their photography. They want some of the things that we've talked about. Interested in. So they were looking at getting a mirrorless camera. They wanted to know my advice, pro and con, about whether or not they should get a mirrorless camera.
Why?
We practiced this! You were here for rehearsal!
What is the difference between a mirrorless and a mirror camera?
Not
like, what's the... Well, okay, sorry.
It's not the question you're supposed to ask. Mm-hmm. What's the question you're supposed to ask?
Why would I get a mirrorless camera is my question.
What?
Oh, well, that's why I asked you about that film footage.
That's the question you were going to ask me.
Oh, what's a mirrorless? What is a mirrorless I'm sorry, what's a mirrorless camera?
Goofball, jeez.
What is a mirrorless camera? And you explained it to me, but...
A camera? It's a camera without a mirror. Now, the next... Teasing. Where's my camera? Okay, so here is a typical DSLR, digital single lens reflex camera. This technology, except for the digital bits, is pretty much the same as it's been for 50, 60 years. What happens is light comes into the lens, it hits a mirror, a literal mirror here. The sensor is back here. The film on a film camera would be back here, and there's a mirror in the middle between the lens and the sensor on the back, or the film on the back. There's a mirror, and that mirror bounces light up to what's called a pentaprism. And there's this another mirror-like device, a 5-sided mirror up here in the top. And the light bounces around in there and comes out through the viewfinder. So the viewfinder on a DSLR is called an optical viewfinder, because what that means is that you're seeing what the lens is.
So I have a question.
Certainly, you shoot.
When you use the term DSLR, does that mean mirror?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. A digital single lens reflex, they're all mirrored cameras. They all have mirrors in them. And so that mirror allows you to see what the lens sees with the back. Not on the screen on the back. The screen is a representation of the mirror. That's the exact thing that your camera is seeing, is through the optical view. Make sense?
With the mirror.
With the mirror. So manufacturers a few years ago just decided to remove the mirror. And that's why mirrorless cameras are about half the thickness, and therefore not half the weight, but a lot less weight, because the body of the camera no longer has to have this mirror assembly. That sound you hear when a camera fires off, you hear that? That sound, part of that sound, the beginning of that sound, is the mirror flipping up out of the way to allow the light to come in and hit the sensor at the back of the camera, or again, film. And then that's the other sound, is the mirror coming back down. There's 3 sounds in there. There's the mirror moving up, there's the shutter opening and closing, and then the mirror moving back down. The downside of one of the downsides of a mirrored camera is if you slow shutter speeds at 2 seconds, at 5 seconds, that action of that mirror moving up and then back down again can move the camera, can shake the camera.
Even on a tripod?
Even on a tripod. Less on a tripod, but certainly no tripod will hold it rock solid steady. It'll still jerk just imperceptibly to our eyes, but it might introduce blur in your shot. So a lot of cameras, the higher end the camera you get, the more likely you're going to have this feature. I've got a feature on this full frame DSLR. It's called mirror lockup. So when I push the shutter, the mirror moves up out of the way and waits for 2 seconds to allow the camera to stop shaking, and then it will take the picture.
Oh, so that answers my next question, is do you have an option on a DSLR to stop your mirror option?
Exactly. Yeah. To have the mirror move up, stop, wait for a period of time, take the picture, and then move back down again.
And do you still get the advantage of having a mirror with that option?
The advantage of having a mirror is the optical viewfinder is that you're seeing what the lens sees. So that's an advantage. But it's also a disadvantage. We'll talk about that in a bit. So mirrorless cameras don't have that mirror. So they don't have the optical viewfinder. In a mirrorless camera, light still comes through the lens, obviously. There is no mirror there, so it goes straight to the back of the camera and hits the sensor. What you're seeing through the viewfinder is not an optical viewfinder, but it's called an electronic viewfinder. You're seeing a representation of what's going through the lens. The sensor is sending that information to a little teeny tiny little television screen back here, and also to a bigger television screen of your lens. So when you're looking at the screen on the back of your camera, on a mirrorless camera, you're not seeing what the lens sees, you're seeing what the sensor sees. And that may not seem like a big difference, but it can make a difference. So you're looking through a little tiny TV screen and a little tiny TV screen here. That sounds good, doesn't it? Except that's where most of your battery usage. Mirrorless cameras generally suck up a lot more battery life than a mirrored camera. This camera, I've got 3 batteries for it. I can go a whole weekend on one charge on one battery, depending on how I'm shooting. My mirrorless cameras, the Olympus M1, I couldn't go a full day shooting. I needed 2 or 3 batteries that day sometimes because your camera is creating this image, this little TV screen, and that uses up a lot more battery on both those lenses. Both those little tiny screens. So the most noticeable difference of a mirrorless camera versus a full-size DSLR is the physical size of it. And that can be good or bad. Mirrorless cameras, because they're thinner, can also be not only narrower body-wise, but narrower width-wise. Width, I guess?
Mm-hmm.
And that, can be good or bad. If you've got a certain size hand, I don't want to say big hand or small hand, a DSLR may be too big, but a mirrorless may be too small as well. The M1, I found it to be very, very tiny. I found it to be a little cramped. And I didn't like shooting with it. It didn't feel solid. It was so small. It was a little bit bigger than a point-and-shoot camera. It felt very, very light. And I couldn't hold the camera the way I'm used to. I hold my camera, I put the camera in the palm of my hand, and my shooting hand, my right hand in my case, is over here where I can get hold of all the buttons. I couldn't do that with the mirrorless. I was doing this almost with the mirrorless and holding it this way. And it didn't feel as steady to me. Plus, the weight of a DSLR, for me personally, I think helps me hold the camera steadier because it's just a heavier thing. But that's not true for everybody. Some folks like a lighter camera. They have smaller hands. They want that compactness of a mirrorless camera. So I tell everybody, if you're thinking about buying any camera, DSLR or mirrorless, whatever it might be, go into a store. Go into your local camera store, your local Best Buy. Feel and hold the camera. See if it feels good. If it has a grip that you feel comfortable with. By the way, if you do that, don't then go to Amazon and buy the damn camera. I rail about this all the time. I hate people who go into a camera store and the sales guy, who's probably working on commission, gives you all this information about this camera versus this camera, then you would go away and buy it for $20 cheaper on Amazon. Don't do that. If it's half price, yes, buy it on Amazon. But if it's just $50 less, buy it from the guy in the store. Give that guy the money. So depending on your physicalness, you may want a smaller camera or you may want a bigger camera. For me, I like a bigger camera. The M1, you like the little M1. We took it to Australia with us, and you took some great shots in Australia. So mirrorless cameras generally are smaller and lighter. You may lose that advantage once you start putting on bigger lenses. If your camera only weighs half a pound, but your lens weighs 4 pounds, you kind of defeated the purpose of a mirrorless camera. We've talked about the optical viewfinder versus the electronic viewfinder. The other advantage of an electronic viewfinder is because you're not seeing what the lens sees, you're seeing what the sensor sees. When you make adjustments on the camera, you see it in the viewfinder. So if you want if you go to shoot and you look at it and you go, oh, it's too dark, and if a If a photo is too dark, what do I have to change to make it?
You have to change the shutter speed to be longer.
Very good. Look at you. Or
Oh. I don't know.
yes, you do. Starts with an A.
Well, the aperture. I don't know how you would change the aperture to increase light.
You'd make the aperture bigger. So you make a smaller aperture number. Remember the fraction?
Oh, yes.
So if you're shooting at f11 and it's a small thing and you find it's too dark, if you make it f4, you're opening up the aperture more so more light can come in.
Okay.
And then the third thing you would do is?
You could change the lighting from wherever you are.
True.
Wherever you are.
What does MacMan say in the...
MacMan's up the ISO. I don't even know what that is.
ISO is
ISO.
the last thing I teach people, the last thing I tell them to change. But ISO is a measure of the light sensitivity of your sensor. So if you make your sensor more sensitive to light, your picture will get brighter. All those things when you're using a DSLR, you're guessing at. If I point at a shot and I look through my optical viewfinder, I can't tell that it's too dark. The numbers in the back of my camera might say that, but I can't see that it's too dark. But on a mirrorless camera, I can see on the back of the screen, it'll show a dark screen. So I know, oh, okay, I'll increase the shutter speed, or I'll increase the aperture, or I'll change, and you'll see those changes live on the screen because you're looking at what the sensor sees. When you change the sensor data, see it live, which is a very handy feature to have in some situations. But again, that's using battery life. If you're using that back screen a lot on your mirrorless camera, make sure you get multiple batteries, at least 2. When you buy your mirrorless camera, buy at least 2 extra batteries because you're going to need them, I promise. So that's the balancing act you do with optical viewfinders versus electronic view. The other big difference when it comes to mirrorless versus DSLR, and the differences have gotten a lot less, is autofocus. Generally speaking, and this is a price point thing, at the lower price point, the price point that beginners are going to shoot at, a DSLR will autofocus faster than a mirrorless camera. So when you push that, when you're looking at that thing and you push that shutter button and you half press it and it does that hunting for focus, it'll happen faster on a DSLR than it will on a mirrorless. But the speed is measured in milliseconds nowadays. It may not make a difference to you. If you're shooting things that are moving quickly, then yes, it'll make a difference. Or you're shooting things that are moving constantly. So you're shooting a horse race and the horses are going by and you want it to autofocus and track as it moves. A mirrorless camera may not be able to do that as fast as a DSLR. Now, the higher range mirrorless cameras have gotten very, very good at continuous autofocus. Very, very good in lower light too. So it depends on the price point. If you're buying a base level mirrorless camera, base level camera and fast autofocus is what you're looking for, you may not want to get a mirrorless, low cost mirrorless camera. You want to bump your price point up. The image quality is pretty much nowadays any camera made in the last 2 years, 3 years, whether it be a mirrorless camera or a DSLR at the same price point, you're going to get good quality images. Don't worry about that. Don't think that mirrorless or DSLRs take better pictures than mirrorless. They really don't. The big differences nowadays are between manufacturers, Canon and Sony and Nikon, not between mirrorless and DSLRs. You're going to get good pictures. If you know what you're doing, you're going to get good pictures out of both of them. Another issue that people mention but really isn't an issue anymore, startup. If I'm standing somewhere and something happens, I can turn my camera on. I can turn my camera on and be ready to shoot instantly. There's no what used to be called lag on startup lag. Point and shoot cameras back in the day would take 10 seconds from the time you turned it on to the time it went through its boot up process. Again, price point wise, the cheaper mirrorless cameras might take a little bit of time, but even nowadays the time is mentioned in seconds. Less than a second from the time you push that button to the time you take a shot. I will often leave my DSLR Actually, I just noticed behind me, this thing has been, last time I used this was probably 2 weeks ago. It's been on for 2 weeks, and the battery is still fine. So I don't generally, when I'm out shooting, ever turn my DSLR off. My mirrorless camera, I turn off after every shot. Just save battery life. That's how much battery drain there is. Another issue is lenses. Because DSLRs have been around for a very, very, very long time, there's all kinds of lenses, both new and used, you can buy. There's a greater selection of lenses for DSLRs than there are for mirrorless cameras. But as a beginner, don't worry about lenses. It's not really a big issue. Until you learn what kind of shooter you are, the kit lens that you're shooting, the 1855 or a 70 to 200, whatever lens you bought when you bought the camera, is going to be good enough until you learn the ins and outs of photography. So don't worry about lens choice just yet. I've always told people your first camera, your first fancy camera, DSLR or mirrorless, won't be your last one. In 3, 4, 5 years, you'll get a new one. And that's when you might start worrying lenses. An issue when I was doing research on this that I hadn't thought of before, that's come up in the last 3 or 4 years with cameras, is stabilization. You're standing there, you're holding your camera, and even your breathing is moving the camera just ever so slightly. So almost every camera manufacturer has stabilization of some kind. The iPhone has optical image stabilization. So do most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. The issue is where that stabilization happens. On a lot of DSLRs, Nikon and Canon included, the stabilization is built into the lens. So the lens mechanism on the inside of it notices you moving in one direction, and it moves the lens in the other direction. It's imperceptible. You can't feel it. You don't notice it. But on a lot of mirrorless cameras, the stabilization is built into the body of the camera. There's good and bad points of it. The image stabilization on a lens is generally going to be better than on a body, but it means you're paying for stabilization for every single lens that you buy, even if you don't need it. On the body, it stays there, and you're paying for it just the one time on the body of the camera. Stabilization will also affect your battery life, because if it's on the body of the camera, it's got to be moving back and forth, and that's going to take up battery life. It's not a huge issue. More and more, actually, even the newer Nikons and Canons are moving towards body image stabilization, because it can be controlled more through software more easily than it can. So that's may or may not be an issue. The biggest thing I find is the physical size of a mirrorless camera versus a DSLR. If you want to be incognito, you want to shoot street photos where you don't having this great big thing in front of your face, you want to travel and travel light. Dave D, when he went to Lisbon with us, he had just his small mirrorless camera. I think he only had 1 or 2 relatively small lenses, whereas I had this 4-pound monster I was carrying around with me on my hip most of the time, and that can get tiring after a while. It can take away some of the pleasure of shooting when you have this big thing that you're lugging around all the time. The next issue, and again, it may not be a big issue, when it comes to shooting video. A lot of folks, I think the camcorder market is dead. I haven't seen anyone using a dedicated camcorder to shoot video in years, because you're either shooting on your phone or you're shooting on your camera. In general, DSLRs, and this is kind of odd, are not very good at shooting video. Mirrorless are quite good, even at the low range, when it comes to shooting video. One of the reasons is because of that autofocus. Because the nature of DSLRs, when you're shooting video, when you push the video record button, you can't change the focus. But you can on a mirrorless, because the mirrorless is doing it on the sensor. So you can change the focus on the sensor. Again, that may not be an issue that you need to worry about as a beginner, but it is something to think about. Maybe if you like shooting a lot of video and you're thinking about getting a camera that does double duty, shooting video and shooting pictures, maybe a mirrorless one would be good for you. Any questions?
If I was a beginner photographer and I said to you, Mr. King, should I get a mirrorless or a DSLR? What should I do?
First thing I would say is, what do you normally shoot? What kind of shooter are you?
Okay.
Because if you like traveling, if you have small hands, if you don't want to spend $1,500, if you want something that's cheap and relatively easy to use, I'd say go with a mirrorless.
Am I going to grow out of it quickly?
Hopefully, yes. Growing out of it quickly means you've learned a lot. But if you bought the camera today, you're not going to grow out of it, assuming your knowledge keeps up, you're not going to grow out of it for 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
You're going to have a very good camera that will allow you to take really good pictures for the next 2 or 3 years at the very least. So I think for a lot of folks, mirrorless is a better option than a full-size DSLR. Mm. But again, go into a store, feel the camera in the store, because that's, if it doesn't feel good, you're not going to take it with you. One of the reasons why I often didn't take the Olympus M1 was like, I'm going to be out all day and I don't want to be cramped with this stuff. Another thing too is because the bigger body on DSLRs allows them to put more buttons and more control on the back of the DSLR, on the top of the DSLR. Mirrorless cameras, because they're a lot smaller, they have to take a lot of these controls and put them in software in your menu, and that may be hard to get at in some things. For example, my exposure compensation on this is one button. You may not even know what that means. You may not care. But I can change things on the camera with the buttons on the back very, very simply, very, very easily. Whereas with the mirrorless camera, you may have to go into a menu to do that, and you may lose the shot because you're hunting around trying to figure out how to change your...
remember that.
As always, if you have any questions about this or anything else about photography, please send me an email. I'm happy to try to help you guys figure this stuff out.